Do you know what absolute silence sounds like? Not the quiet of an empty room, but the suffocating, deliberate silence of a man who has decided the world is no longer safe to speak to. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reynolds was a ghost trapped in a shattered body, a legendary Tier 1 sniper who hadn't uttered a single syllable since a catastrophic, highly classified ambush in the Korangal Valley. The top military doctors called it severe traumatic mutism. The psychiatrists called it a permanent, irreversible break from reality. But they were all wrong. Thomas wasn't broken. He was waiting, and he kept waiting, wrapped in his impenetrable, heavily guarded silence, until a graveyard shift nurse saw his fingers twitch in the shadows, locked eyes with the deadly operator, and instinctively flashed back the exact, classified hand signal of his slaughtered squad. Walter Reed, National Military Medical Center, hums with a specific frequency at 2 a.m. It is a sterile, mechanical drone composed of heart monitors, the rhythmic hiss of ventilators, and the soft, squeaking soles of medical staff walking the polished linoleum floors. But in Ward 7, Bravo, the restricted high-security wing reserved for special operations personnel and high-value intelligence assets, the silence was always heavier. Abigail Preston knew that heavy silence intimately. As a senior trauma nurse who had spent 4 years attached to an Air Force Special Operations Surgical Team, SOST, before transitioning to Walter Reed, she had patched up the most elite, hardened men on the planet. She had seen bodies torn apart by shrapnel, minds fractured by concussive blasts, and souls eroded by the unimaginable weight of covert warfare. But she had never seen anyone quite like Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reynolds. Thomas arrived at Walter Reed on a dreary Tuesday in November, flanked by armed military police and 2 stern-faced intelligence officers from the Department of Defense who refused to leave his side until the surgical teams officially took custody. His medical file was thick enough to serve as a doorstop, yet almost entirely redacted. Entire pages were blacked out with heavy marker. What wasn't redacted painted a grim picture. Multiple gunshot wounds to the torso, severe shrapnel lacerations across his left shoulder and neck, and a grade 3 traumatic brain injury sustained during an operation that officially never happened. But the physical wounds, though catastrophic, were healing. The surgical teams had done their miraculous work, piecing his fractured collarbone back together and repairing his punctured lung. It was his mind that remained utterly unreachable. Since the moment the medevac chopper lifted him out of whatever hellscape he had barely survived, Thomas had not spoken a single word. Not a grunt of pain. Not a sigh. Nothing. Dr. Benjamin Carter, the brilliant but aggressively arrogant head of psychiatric trauma at Walter Reed, had spent 3 weeks trying to crack the sniper's silence. Abby had stood in the corner of Thomas's dimly lit room during dozens of these sessions, watching Dr. Carter pace the floor, his clipboard clutched tightly against his chest. "Chief Reynolds," Dr. Carter would say, his voice adopting that patronizing, slow cadence reserved for the profoundly damaged. "I need you to understand that you are safe. You're in Bethesda, Maryland. The war is over for you, but I cannot authorize your transition to outpatient rehabilitation until you communicate with us. Do you understand?" Thomas would just sit there in his hospital bed, his posture rigid, his back completely unsupported by the pillows. His eyes, a piercing, icy blue, never focused on Dr. Carter. Instead, they constantly scanned the room. He tracked the door. He tracked the window. He tracked the reflection in the metallic casing of the paper towel dispenser. He was entirely disconnected from the doctor's words, trapped in a relentless, invisible patrol. "It's a textbook case of catatonic withdrawal," Dr. Carter declared to Abby one evening at the nurse's station, furiously scribbling notes. "The TBI combined with immense survivor's guilt. His entire squad was wiped out, Abigail. He's the sole survivor. The brain simply shuts down the vocal cords as a trauma response. He might never speak again." Abby looked up from her charting, her eyes drifting down the hallway toward room 714. "With respect, Dr. Carter, he doesn't look catatonic to me. Catatonia implies a lack of presence, a disconnect. Have you looked at his eyes? He's not checked out. He's hypervigilant. Carter sighed, rubbing his temples. Nurse Preston, I appreciate your combat experience. I truly do. But hypervigilance is a standard symptom of severe PTSD. He's experiencing autonomic arousal without a cognitive outlet. He's a broken machine. Abby didn't argue further. You didn't win arguments with Dr. Benjamin Carter. But as she walked back toward room 714 to check Thomas's IV line, she felt a gnawing sensation in her gut. She had treated broken men before. Men who wept silently into their pillows. Men who stared blankly at the ceiling, their spirits completely hollowed out. Thomas Reynolds wasn't hollow. As Abby stepped quietly into his room, adjusting the flow rate on his saline drip, she felt the immediate weight of his gaze. He didn't turn his head, but his eyes tracked her hand with predatory precision. He was assessing her movements, measuring the distance between them, analyzing the placement of the trauma shears clipped to her scrubs. He wasn't a broken machine. He was a weapon that someone had left fully loaded, with the safety off, in the middle of a hospital room. And for the past month, he had been utterly alone in his head. The mystery of Thomas Reynolds began to unravel, not in a grand, cinematic, psychiatric breakthrough, but in the smallest, most insignificant of movements. Abby's background in SOST meant she had lived and breathed the culture of Tier 1 operators. She had deployed to undisclosed locations in Syria and Iraq, running makeshift trauma bays in the backs of unarmored helicopters and shattered concrete buildings. She understood the silent, lethal men who operated in the shadows. She knew that these men didn't break down like normal people. They compartmentalized, folding their trauma into tiny, dark boxes until the structural integrity of their minds finally collapsed. It was during the 3rd week of November, during the agonizingly slow hours of the 3 a.m. shift, that Abby first noticed the twitch. She was sitting in the low light of room 714, silently charting Thomas's vitals on her tablet. Thomas was lying in bed, his eyes open, staring at the darkened television screen mounted on the wall. From a distance, he looked like a statue. But as Abby glanced up, her trained eyes caught a subtle rhythm playing out on the edge of the white cotton bedsheets. Thomas's right hand was resting flat against his thigh. His index finger extended smoothly, tapped the fabric twice, then curled back in. A second later, his thumb brushed against his middle finger in a rapid, deliberate flick. Then his hand went completely flat, fingers tightly pressed together, before his palm rotated exactly 90 degrees to face the floor. He held the position for 5 seconds. Then the sequence started again. Abby froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Earlier that day, Doctor. Carter had noted the hand movements in his chart, dismissing them as focal motor seizures caused by the traumatic brain injury. He had even prescribed a mild anticonvulsant to stop the nervous tics. But Abby knew better. She had spent hundreds of hours in the pitch-black bellies of C-130 transport planes, watching operators communicate over the deafening roar of the engines without uttering a single sound. That wasn't a nervous tic, it was a language. Thomas was signing. She leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes as she watched his fingers move again in the dim, ambient light from the hallway. Index finger tap. Enemy. Thumb flick. 2 contacts. Flat hand, palm down, hold position. Wait. Her breath hitched in her throat. Thomas wasn't staring blankly at the television screen. He was using the dark, reflective surface of the screen as a mirror to watch the doorway behind her, and his hand, resting out of sight of anyone standing at the door, was constantly broadcasting tactical updates to a squad that was no longer there. He was trapped in an infinite loop of the ambush. Abby felt a wave of profound sorrow wash over her, quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. If she was right, Thomas wasn't mute because his brain had broken. He was mute because, in his mind, he was still behind enemy lines. He was maintaining strict noise discipline. To speak would be to give away his position to the enemy. He was still fighting the war, completely alone, in the sterile silence of Ward 7 Bravo. The realization was terrifying. It meant that every time Dr. Carter or the orderlies approached him, speaking loudly and touching him without warning, they weren't comforting a patient. They were hostile contacts breaking his perimeter. Abby carefully set her tablet down on the rolling tray. She knew she had to test her theory, but she had to be incredibly careful. If she startled him, a man with his lethal training could react with devastating violence before his conscious mind could stop him. She stood up slowly, keeping her hands visible. She didn't speak. She took one deliberate step backward, moving out of his direct line of sight in the television's reflection. Thomas's fingers immediately stopped moving. His entire body tensed, the muscles in his forearms pulling taut beneath his skin. The sudden absence of his nurse in his peripheral vision had triggered an alarm in his highly calibrated nervous system. Slowly, deliberately, Abby moved to the foot of his bed. She stood perfectly still, waiting for him to look at her. For an agonizing minute, he didn't move. Then, ever so slowly, his icy blue eyes shifted from the television screen and locked onto hers. The intensity of his stare was almost physical, a heavy pressure pressing against her chest. Abby didn't say a word. She kept her face completely neutral, an impassive mask. Slowly, she raised her right hand to her chest level. She extended her index and middle finger, touching her own eyes, then pointed directly at him. "I see you." Thomas didn't react. Not a blink. Not a breath. Abby lowered her hand. She waited. Nothing happened. After 5 minutes of suffocating silence, Abby slowly backed out of the room. When she reached the nurse's station, her hands were trembling so badly she nearly dropped her pen. Had she imagined it? Was she projecting her own SOST experiences onto a severely brain-damaged man? She pulled up his heavily redacted file again, staring at the black ink. Thomas Reynolds, DevGru, Red Squadron. These guys didn't use standard infantry hand signals. They had their own highly evolved, customized, squad-level microsigns. Variations of variations, designed to be executed with the slightest twitch of a finger while holding a rifle. If she wanted to break through his wall, she couldn't just use standard signs. She needed to speak his specific dialect. But how could she possibly learn the classified comms of a dead Tier 1 unit? 2 nights later, the severe Maryland winter delivered a violent, unforgiving thunderstorm. The wind howled against the reinforced glass of Walter Reed, and heavy sheets of rain lashed the exterior of the hospital. Inside Ward 7 Bravo, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Storms always agitated the combat veterans. The sharp, unpredictable cracks of thunder sounded entirely too much like artillery fire, and the erratic pressure drops set off invisible tripwires in their minds. Abby was at the central desk, reviewing lab results with Chief Medical Officer Diane Hughes when the lights flickered. "Generator should kick in," Diane muttered, not looking up from her screen. A split second later, a massive lightning strike hit a transformer just outside the perimeter fence. The sound was deafening, a concussive, explosive boom that rattled the coffee mugs on the desk and vibrated through the floorboards. Instantly, the entire ward was plunged into pitch blackness. The emergency backup generators took exactly 4.2 seconds to engage. But for a combat veteran with severe trauma, 4 seconds of sudden, explosive darkness is an eternity. It is enough time to travel thousands of miles back to a nightmare. When the dim, red emergency lights flickered to life, the ward was in chaos. Alarms began blaring from ventilators that had temporarily lost power. Nurses were shouting down the hall, and from room 714 there came a horrible, violent crash. "Reynolds!" Abby gasped, sprinting out from behind the desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She burst through the heavy door of Thomas's room, followed closely by 2 burly military orderlies, Jackson and Davis. The hospital bed was empty. The IV pole had been violently knocked over, saline and blood pooling on the linoleum. The heart monitor wires had been ripped violently from the wall. "Where is he?" Jackson yelled, stepping fully into the room, reaching for the heavy-duty soft restraints clipped to his belt. "Stop! Don't move!" Abby screamed, throwing her arm out to block the orderly. In the darkest corner of the room, crouched between the heavy wardrobe and the wall, was Thomas. He was a terrifying sight. He had ripped the IV line directly out of his arm, and a steady stream of dark blood was running down his forearm, dripping from his clenched fist onto the floor. His hospital gown was torn. He was entirely crouched on the balls of his feet, his weight perfectly balanced, his uninjured right arm raised in front of him as if he were holding a phantom assault rifle, the stock pulled tight into his shoulder. His eyes were wide, dilated, and absolutely wild. He wasn't in Bethesda anymore. He was back in the Korengal, and he was surrounded by the enemy. "Chief Reynolds, we're going to have to secure you," Davis said, his voice trembling slightly, as he unclipped his restraints and took a heavy step forward. Thomas's response was instantaneous. He let out a low, guttural snarl, the first sound he had made in a month, and shifted his weight, his phantom rifle tracking Davis's chest. His left hand shot up, fingers moving in a frantic, blindingly fast sequence, fist clenched, 2 fingers down, palm out. Jackson and Davis had no idea what he was doing. They just saw a deranged, bleeding patient gearing up to attack. They moved in, hands outstretched. "Get back!" Abby roared, physically shoving Jackson backwards with a strength born of pure adrenaline. "Get out of the room! Both of you, now!" "Abby, he's bleeding out. He needs to be restrained. If you touch him, he will kill you," Abby snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "He thinks you're hostiles. Get the hell out and shut the door!" Reluctantly, intimidated by the fierce authority of the SOST nurse, the orderlies backed out into the hallway. Abby slammed the door shut behind them, cutting off the noise of the alarms. She turned slowly back to Thomas. He hadn't moved. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his chest heaving. Blood continued to patter against the linoleum. Drip, drip, drip. He stared at Abby, his eyes locked onto her face, searching for a threat. His left hand went up again, fist clenched, 2 fingers down, palm out. Abby's mind raced. What did it mean? It was a DevGru modification. She had to guess based on standard routes. Fist is usually freeze. Palm out is stop or hold. 2 fingers down, hold fire. Multiple armed contacts. He was warning her. Even in the depths of his flashback, completely untethered from reality, his core programming remained intact. He was warning a friendly to stay back from the kill zone. Abby knew that if she spoke, the illusion would shatter, or worse, he wouldn't process the English language at all. She had to enter his world. She had to use his vocabulary. She took a slow, deep breath, forcing her own trembling hands to steady. She dropped to one knee, lowering her profile to make herself entirely non-threatening, matching his tactical elevation. She looked him dead in his wild, terrified eyes. She raised her right hand, slowly, deliberately. She tapped the top of her own head with a flat palm. "Cover." She pointed to herself, then pointed to the door. "I am securing the perimeter." Then she made a fist and slowly opened it, spreading her fingers wide. "Clear." Thomas froze. The ragged, heavy breathing suddenly stopped. He stared at her hand. Then he stared at her face. The terrifying, feral wildness in his eyes began to fracture, replaced by a profound, agonizing confusion. He blinked, a slow, heavy blink. His left hand trembled slightly. He raised it. He tapped his chest. "Friendly?" Abby swallowed hard, fighting back the tears stinging her eyes. She maintained her composure. She tapped her chest, then gave a single, firm nod. "Friendly." The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the heavy, defensive silence of an ambush. It was the fragile, terrifying silence of a bridge being built over a bottomless chasm. Thomas slowly lowered his phantom rifle. His shoulders slumped. The immense, coiled tension in his body seemed to evaporate all at once. He looked down at the blood dripping from his arm, as if noticing it for the very first time. Then he looked back at Abby. And what he did next sent a chill straight down to her marrow. He didn't sign a standard tactical command. He didn't sign "need medic" or "secure." He raised his hand, his fingers completely slick with his own blood. He formed an O with his thumb and index finger, then slashed his hand horizontally across his throat, finishing by tapping his left shoulder blade twice. Abby's blood ran completely cold. She knew exactly what that sequence meant, not from standard soft comms, but from the whispered rumors of Black Ops survival protocols. Omaha, compromised from within. Betrayal. He wasn't suffering from survivor's guilt. He wasn't hiding from the enemy in the Korengal Valley. He was hiding from the people who had sent him there. Thomas Reynolds finally opened his mouth. His voice, unused for months, cracked like dry earth. It was a harsh, agonizing whisper that barely carried over the sound of the rain lashing against the window. They knew, he rasped, his eyes burning into hers. Our own guys. They gave us up. Before Abby could process the sheer magnitude of the treason he had just confessed, the heavy door to room 714 swung open. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the red emergency lights of the hallway, wasn't Dr. Carter. It was one of the stern-faced Department of Defense intelligence officers who had accompanied Thomas on his first day. The man's eyes flicked from the blood on the floor to Abby's kneeling form, and finally to Thomas's face. "Is there a problem here, Nurse Preston?" the suited man asked, his voice smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of concern. Thomas instantly went rigid, his jaw snapping shut, the invisible padlock clicking back into place. The ghost had returned. Abby stood up slowly, positioning her body subtly between the intelligence officer and her patient. She looked at the man's dark suit, then down at the blood-stained floor, her mind racing with the deadly secret now resting heavily on her shoulders. "No problem, sir," Abby said, her voice steady, perfectly masking the terror blooming in her chest. "Just a little thunder. I have everything under control." But as the officer smiled thinly and stepped into the room, Abby knew the truth. Nothing was under control. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to Bethesda, and she was now a target. Thunder rattled the reinforced windows of Ward 7 Bravo, masking the heavy, suffocating tension inside room 714. Abigail Preston stood her ground, her body a deliberate shield between the trembling, bleeding sniper and the immaculate, terrifying presence of the Department of Defense intelligence officer. "Just a little thunder," Abby repeated, her voice dripping with practiced, clinical detachment. Patient Reynolds suffered a severe focal motor seizure induced by the sudden loss of light and the auditory trigger. "I need to administer a sedative and re-establish his IV line immediately, sir. I'll have to ask you to step outside to maintain a sterile field." The officer, whose ID badge read Agent Nathan Cross, did not move. His eyes, the color of wet slate, drifted over Abby's shoulder to where Thomas was crouched. Cross's lips curled into a faint, condescending smirk, the arrogant smile of a man who believed he owned every life in the room. "A seizure," Cross repeated softly, the word rolling off his tongue like a venomous joke. "Interesting. He looked quite tactical for a man having a neurological episode. Make sure he's secured, Nurse Preston. We wouldn't want the chief hurting himself before his transfer." Cross turned on his heel and walked out, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the linoleum. Abby waited until the heavy door clicked shut. She exhaled a shaky breath and turned back to Thomas. He was still pressed against the wall, but the feral panic had receded, replaced by a profound, agonizing exhaustion. The ghost was back, but this time the silence wasn't a symptom of a broken mind. It was a calculated, desperate survival tactic. The next 48 hours became a high-stakes, invisible chess match. Agent Cross's presence on the ward tripled. 2 armed military contractors were stationed directly outside room 714, and Abby noticed a new, discreet black dome mounted in the ceiling corner of Thomas's room. A camera. They were watching his every twitch. Abby knew she had to play the part of the oblivious, overworked nurse. She went about her duties with robotic efficiency, changing bandages, checking vitals, and ignoring the heavy, watchful presence of the guards. But beneath her clinical exterior, a fierce, protective fire was burning. She was an underdog in a facility run by arrogant bureaucrats and shadowed by corrupt intelligence. But they had underestimated one crucial detail. She was a SOST trauma nurse. She knew how to operate in hostile territory. The camera had a flaw. Abby had spent enough time staring at the ceiling during the night shifts to calculate the lens's field of view. The heavy oak wardrobe, positioned to the right of Thomas's bed, created a small, triangular blind spot roughly 2 feet wide near the baseboard. At 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, Abby walked into room 714, carrying a fresh stack of linens and a small, sterile dressing kit. She moved deliberately, blocking the camera's line of sight with her body as she approached the bed. Thomas was awake, his icy blue eyes tracking her every move. The connection between them had shifted irrevocably since the storm. There was a raw, unspoken vulnerability in his gaze now when he looked at her. It was the look of a man who had expected to die alone in the dark, suddenly realizing someone was holding a lantern. Abby leaned over him, her face inches from his, ostensibly to check his pupil dilation. Her breath ghosted across his cheek, and for a fraction of a second, his gaze dropped to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. The air between them crackled with a sudden, intense heat, a desperate, terrifying intimacy born of shared peril. "I know they're watching," Abby whispered, her voice so low it was merely a vibration against his skin. She slipped a tiny, torn piece of a medical chart and a stubby charcoal pencil from her sleeve, dropping them perfectly into his palm, which rested in the blind spot beside his hip. "Right." She stood up, loudly smoothing the blankets and checking the IV drip, buying him time. A minute later, as she reached down to adjust his leg restraint, his fingers brushed against hers. The touch sent a jolt of electricity up her arm. He pressed the folded scrap of paper into her palm. Abby walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and turned on the faucet. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was jagged, forced out by a man whose muscles were still relearning fine motor control, but the message was clear and damning. Target wasn't hostile. Target was our own CIA asset, moving black budget cash. Millions. We saw the handoff. Command ordered an airstrike on our coordinates to erase the witnesses. Cross was the handler. If I speak, I'm dead. If you help me, you are too. Abby stared at the paper as the water rushed into the sink. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering. An entire Tier 1 squad, America's most elite, dedicated sons, slaughtered like cattle to protect a corrupt intelligence officer's illicit fortune. Cross had arranged the ambush, and now he was here to ensure the sole survivor never testified. She looked at her reflection in the sterile hospital mirror. She was just a nurse, from a working-class neighborhood, entirely out of her depth against a heavily armed, politically connected defense agent. She had every reason to walk away, to burn the paper, and to forget she ever saw it. But as she remembered Thomas's eyes, the profound betrayal, the agonizing loneliness, and the flicker of desperate hope when she had signaled him back, her jaw set. She flushed the paper down the toilet. They had underestimated Thomas Reynolds, and they were about to underestimate her. The arrogance of powerful men is almost always their undoing. Agent Nathan Cross was no exception. He moved through the halls of Walter Reed as if he owned the foundation it was built upon, viewing the medical staff as nothing more than an annoying inconvenience. On Thursday afternoon, the other shoe dropped. Dr. Benjamin Carter, the aggressively pompous head of psychiatric trauma, called a sudden meeting at the nurses' station. Cross stood right behind him, his hands steepled, watching the staff with cold amusement. "Effective midnight tomorrow," Dr. Carter announced, adjusting his glasses. Chief Petty Officer Reynolds is being transferred. Due to his continued lack of progress and violent outbursts, his care is being downgraded. He will be moved to the Belvoir Annex for intensive, long-term psychiatric confinement. Abby's blood ran cold. The Belvoir Annex was a well-known euphemism among the Essoff community. It was a black site medical facility. Once a compromised operative went in, they never came out. It was where inconvenient minds were heavily medicated into permanent oblivion. "Dr. Carter," Abby spoke up, her voice perfectly modulating a tone of professional concern. "Patient Reynolds is still recovering from severe lung trauma. A transport at this stage could precipitate a pulmonary embolism. It's highly irregular." Dr. Carter scowled, his ego visibly bruised by a nurse questioning his authority in front of a federal agent. "Nurse Preston, your job is to change bandages, not to interpret psychiatric transfer protocols. The decision is final." As the staff dispersed, Cross casually intercepted Abby in the break room. He poured himself a cup of coffee, moving with predatory grace. "You're very dedicated to your patient, Abigail," Cross murmured, not looking at her as he stirred his coffee. "It's admirable, but some patients are simply beyond saving. They become liabilities." He took a slow sip, finally locking his slate-grey eyes on hers. The threat was entirely unmasked. Nurses who ask too many questions, who try to play hero, often find their careers abruptly terminated, or they find themselves in very tragic, unavoidable accidents. Do we understand each other? Abby forced her hands to tremble slightly. She widened her eyes, playing the role of the intimidated, helpless civilian to absolute perfection. I understand, Agent Cross. I just didn't want him to get hurt during transport." "Good girl," Cross sneered, his ego immensely satisfied by her apparent fear. He patted her shoulder condescendingly and walked out. Abby stared at his retreating back, the facade of fear instantly vanishing, replaced by a cold, calculated fury. Cross thought he had won. He thought she was broken. She walked back to room 714. Thomas was watching her, his jaw tight. He had heard the announcement through the open door. He knew what Belvoir meant. Abby stepped into the camera's blind spot by his bed. She didn't offer him paper this time. Instead, she took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, and searingly warm. He gripped her fingers tightly, a silent plea and a desperate apology all rolled into one. Using her index finger, she slowly tapped a Morse code sequence onto the inside of his wrist, a skill she had learned from a comms specialist in Ramadi. TOMORRO, WYHALT, TRANSFER. Thomas's eyes widened. He shook his head violently, his thumb frantically pressing against her palm. NODANGER. RUN. He was trying to protect her. Even facing certain death at a black site, his first instinct was to shield the woman who had pulled him out of the dark. The realization made Abby's heart ache with a fierce, protective love she hadn't known she was capable of. She leaned in close, her lips brushing the edge of his ear, ensuring her face was completely hidden from the camera. "I don't leave my team behind, Chief," she whispered fiercely, "and I don't lose to arrogant bastards in expensive suits." She pulled back, giving him a single, definitive nod. She didn't have weapons, she didn't have clearance, but she had the entire medical protocol of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center at her disposal, and she knew exactly how to weaponize it. She was going to induce a localized, highly controlled medical crisis right under Cross's nose. The ghost of Ward 7 Bravo wasn't leaving this hospital. The clock on the wall of Ward 7 Bravo ticked mercilessly toward midnight. The hospital, usually a sanctuary of healing, felt like a tightening snare. In exactly 45 minutes, the covert transport team would arrive to take Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reynolds to the Belvoir Annex. Abigail Preston was entirely out of her depth in the world of espionage, but inside a trauma bay, she was a god. She had spent the last 6 hours meticulously reviewing the pharmacological limits of a recovering grade 3 TBI patient with a healing punctured lung. She couldn't give him anything systemic that would permanently damage his neurological recovery, but she needed a catastrophic, undeniable physical failure, something that would require immediate, invasive surgical intervention right here at Walter Reed. She settled on the most dangerous, audacious play in the SOST playbook, a medically induced artificial tension pneumothorax. If she injected 50 cubic centimeters of sterile, pressurized air directly into his pleural cavity, the delicate space between his lung and his chest wall, it would instantly mimic a spontaneous lung collapse. His oxygen saturation would plummet, the monitors would scream, a portable X-ray would confirm a massive dark pocket of air crushing his left lung. The only medical response would be an emergency chest tube insertion and immediate grounding in the ICU. No doctor, not even the arrogant Dr. Benjamin Carter, could authorize moving a patient with an active, unstabilized chest tube. At 11:20 p.m., Abby walked into room 714. She had a heavy, sterile surgical tray balanced in her hands. Hidden beneath the surgical drapes was a large-gauge syringe, completely empty, except for purified room air. Agent Nathan Cross was standing by the window, checking his immaculate Rolex. 2 heavily armed private contractors flanked the door. "Final vitals check, Agent Cross," Abby said, her voice a perfect monotone. "Hospital policy before a high-risk transfer." Cross didn't even look up from his phone. "Make it quick, Nightingale. The convoy is 3 minutes out." Abby moved to the side of the bed, perfectly positioning her body to block the ceiling camera's line of sight to Thomas's left torso. Thomas looked up at her. The icy blue of his eyes was shadowed with the grim realization of his impending execution. But as Abby locked eyes with him, she didn't show fear. She showed absolute, terrifying resolve. She pulled the curtain around the bed, a standard privacy measure that made Cross sigh loudly in annoyance. "Really, nurse? We're a bit past modesty," Cross drawled from the other side of the fabric. "Protocol, sir," Abby replied sharply. Beneath the cover of the curtain, Abby moved with lightning speed. She pulled down the collar of Thomas's gown, exposing his left chest wall. The skin was heavily scarred from the shrapnel wounds that had nearly killed him in the Korangal Valley. She picked up the syringe. She didn't have time to explain the procedure, the agonizing pain he was about to experience, or the incredible risk she was taking. If she missed the pleural space and hit an artery, she could kill him. She looked into his eyes. She pressed 2 fingers to her own chest, then pointed the needle at his ribs. "Trust me." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He looked at the needle, then looked deeply into Abby's eyes. In that fleeting second, the sterile hospital room faded. He saw the woman who had listened to his silence, the woman who had stood between him and a monster in a tailored suit. Slowly he reached up, his rough, calloused fingers brushing gently against her cheek, a touch so tender and heartbreakingly deliberate that it made Abby's breath catch. Then he dropped his hand, gripped the metal bed rails, and gave her a single, firm nod. "Do it!" Abby sterilized the injection site between his 3rd and 4th ribs. She took a deep breath, praying to whatever gods watched over foolish, desperate nurses. She plunged the needle in, precisely angling it past the intercostal muscles, and depressed the plunger, forcing the air into the cavity. Thomas's entire body went rigid. His eyes flew wide open in silent, excruciating agony as the sudden pocket of air violently compressed his healing lung. He bit down so hard on his own lip that a drop of blood welled up, but true to his Tier 1 training, he did not make a single sound. Abby swiftly withdrew the needle, slapped a sterile dressing over the tiny puncture mark, and hid the syringe in her deep scrub pocket. "Okay, Chief," she whispered, her voice trembling with adrenaline and tears as she watched him struggle to breathe. "Let's put on a show." She ripped the privacy curtain back. "All done, Agent Cross," Abby said, stepping away from the bed. 10 seconds later, the artificial pneumothorax took full effect. The heart monitor mounted on the wall beside Thomas's bed did not merely beep. It emitted a piercing, high-pitched and continuous scream that violently shattered the heavy silence of Ward 7 Bravo. Within a fraction of a second, the glowing digital numbers on the screen initiated a terrifying freefall. Thomas's oxygen saturation, which had been holding at a steady 98%, plummeted to 85, then staggered down to a critical 79. The rhythmic, reassuring green line of his heartbeat transformed into an erratic, jagged mountain range of crimson warnings. Thomas began to thrash violently against the sterile white sheets. The artificial tension pneumothorax Abby had just induced was taking catastrophic physical effect. His face, previously pale from months of confinement, drained into a terrifying, ashen shade of grey. His chest heaved with immense, desperate force as his right lung fought a losing battle to compensate for the sudden, crushing pressure of the 50 cubic centimeters of air now trapped inside his left pleural cavity. To the untrained eye, he was a man spontaneously dying. To Abby, he was enduring agonizing, suffocating pain with the silent, iron-willed discipline of a Tier 1 operator. Agent Nathan Cross spun around so fast his expensive leather shoes squeaked against the linoleum. The arrogant, composed facade he had maintained for weeks instantly cracked. His phone slipped from his fingers, clattering uselessly to the floor. "What did you do?" Cross snarled, lunging towards the foot of the bed, his slate-grey eyes wide with sudden panic. "Nothing! He's crashing!" Abby screamed, instantly shifting her demeanor into the highest gear of medical emergency. She slammed her open palm against the blue code button on the wall, triggering the ward's primary emergency network. The hallway outside immediately erupted into a symphony of running footsteps, shouting voices, and rolling carts. Dr. Benjamin Carter sprinted into the room mere seconds later. The usually immaculate, aggressively pompous head of psychiatric trauma looked entirely disheveled. His tie was askew, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, and his eyes darted frantically around the room, entirely out of his depth in a raw trauma situation. "What is happening here? He was perfectly stable 10 minutes ago. His vitals were cleared for transport," Carter yelled over the deafening mechanical wail of the alarms. "Sudden respiratory collapse. He has significantly decreased breath sounds on the entire left side. And I'm seeing rapid tracheal deviation," Abby shouted back, her voice projecting with the commanding authority of a veteran SOST nurse. She fired off the textbook, "Undeniable symptoms of a lethal tension pneumothorax. His lung just recollapsed, Dr. Carter. The pressure is building against his heart. We need a crash cart, an immediate portable X-ray, and a sterile emergency chest tube tray right now." Carter, a man who had spent the last 2 decades diagnosing psychological disorders from the safety of a leather chair, froze completely. He stared at the thrashing, suffocating sniper, his hands trembling at his sides. He had not performed an invasive surgical procedure since his residency. "Fix him!" Cross roared, grabbing Carter violently by the lapels of his white laboratory coat and shaking him. The intelligence officer was completely losing control of his carefully orchestrated Black Ops assassination. "The covert transport team is waiting in the basement loading dock. He is leaving this building tonight, Doctor. I don't care if he's breathing or not." "He cannot be moved," Abby countered fiercely. She physically stepped around the bed, wedging her own body between the 2 heavily armed private contractors and her patient. "If you take him off this high-flow oxygen supply, or if you lay him flat on a transport gurney, his heart will stop beating before the elevator reaches the ground floor. He requires immediate surgical decompression." Before Cross could physically force her out of the way, the heavy double doors of room 714 were violently shoved open. The night shift radiology technician, a burly man named Lewis, burst into the room maneuvering a massive, hulking, portable X-ray machine. "Clear the bed! Shoot the film! Now!" Abby ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument or hesitation. Lewis swiftly slid the digital imaging plate beneath Thomas's trembling back and swung the mechanical arm of the machine over his chest. "Clear!" Lewis shouted, pressing the exposure button. The machine hummed, and within 60 agonizing seconds, the high-resolution digital image populated on the glowing monitor screen. The image was undeniably catastrophic. There, displayed for everyone in the room to see, was a massive, pitch-black void occupying the entirety of Thomas's left chest cavity. The air pocket had pushed his heart entirely off-center, dangerously compressing his remaining healthy lung. "Good God," Dr. Carter whispered, all the color draining from his face as he stared at the screen. "It really is a massive tension pneumothorax. How is this medically possible?" He was healing. The previous shrapnel damage from the Korangal ambush must have severely weakened his pleural lining, Abby lied flawlessly. Her face remained a perfect mask of clinical urgency, betraying absolutely none of the brilliant, desperate sabotage she had just committed. "Dr. Carter, you are the highest-ranking physician on this floor. You have to insert a 28 French chest tube to decompress the cavity immediately, or his heart will suffer a fatal arrhythmia in the next 3 minutes." Carter backed away from the bed, shaking his head frantically. I can't. I am not a trauma surgeon, Nurse Preston. I don't have the muscle memory for a blind thoracic insertion." "I do not care about his damn lung," Cross shouted, his voice cracking with unchecked, desperate rage. The slick, untouchable federal agent realized his window to silence the sniper was closing permanently. In a blind panic, completely abandoning the protocol of his station, Cross reached beneath his tailored suit jacket. He drew a silenced, matte black compact pistol from his shoulder holster, racking the slide with a terrifying metallic click, and pointed it directly at the center of Dr. Carter's chest. "Put this patient on the goddamn gurney right now, Doctor," Cross commanded, his voice dropping to a lethal, trembling whisper. "We are leaving. Anyone who attempts to stop this transport will be classified as a threat to national security and dealt with accordingly." The room plunged into a suffocating, terrifying silence, broken only by the frantic, dying rhythm of Thomas's heart monitor. The two private contractors, sensing their boss's escalation, simultaneously raised their suppressed rifles, sweeping the barrels across Abby and the terrified radiology technician. Abby slowly raised her hands, her palms facing outward. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs, but a fierce, triumphant fire burned in her chest. Cross had finally overplayed his hand. He was so accustomed to bullying his way through the shadows, operating in undisclosed black sites and war-torn valleys, that he had entirely forgotten he was standing in the middle of a brightly lit, highly populated federal hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. "Agent Cross," a deep, resonant and incredibly authoritative voice boomed from the open doorway. "Lower your weapon, immediately." Cross whipped his head around, the barrel of his pistol tracking towards the sound. Standing in the doorway, completely filling the frame, was Captain David Hayes. He was a heavily decorated JSOC commander, a legend within the Special Operations community, and most importantly, Abby's former commanding officer from her grueling deployments in Syria. Behind Captain Hayes stood a dozen heavily armed military police officers. They poured into the room and fanned out with flawless tactical precision. The distinct, terrifying sound of a dozen assault rifles being simultaneously taken off safety echoed off the sterile walls. Their weapons were trained squarely on the center mass of Agent Cross and his two stunned contractors. Abby let out a long, ragged breath she felt like she had been holding for an eternity. 2 hours ago, while Cross thought she was merely fetching fresh linens, Abby had used the hospital's secure internal pharmacy terminal to send a highly classified, heavily encrypted requisition order to the Pentagon's Medical Liaison Office. It was a coded distress signal known only to SOST veterans, a ghost protocol designed to summon the cavalry when command structures were compromised. Captain Hayes had received the signal, recognized his best trauma nurse's ID code, and mobilized a JSOC response team within minutes. "Captain Hayes," Cross sneered, his upper lip curling into an ugly, desperate snarl. though his gun hand wavered noticeably under the weight of a dozen laser sights painting his chest red. "You are severely out of your jurisdiction. This is a highly classified Department of Defense intelligence transfer. You are actively interfering with matters of national security." "I'm actively interfering with a premeditated murder," Hayes shot back, stepping confidently into the room, his eyes locked onto the corrupt intelligence officer. "Stand down, Cross. You have zero authority in this facility. You are hereby relieved of your command, and you are under military arrest for treason, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit the murder of Allied personnel." Cross let out a dark, mocking laugh that sounded more like a cough. He tightened his grip on his pistol, refusing to surrender. "You have absolutely no proof of any of those charges, Hayes. You have the word of a hysterical trauma nurse and a brain-damaged, catatonic mute. Good luck getting a federal indictment out of a ghost." The room held its breath. The standoff teetered on the razor's edge of a bloodbath, and then, suddenly, a harsh, agonizing rasp cut through the heavy tension of the room. It was a sound like dry earth cracking open, a voice that had not been used in months, forcing its way past vocal cords paralyzed by trauma and a throat crushed by lack of oxygen. "Alpha 4, coordinate, strike." Every single person in the room froze. Thomas Reynolds, fighting through the excruciating, blinding pain of his compressed lung, forced his broken body to move. His heavily scarred arm reached out, gripping the metal bedrail with white-knuckled intensity, and he painfully pulled himself up into a seated position. The icy, terrifying, and utterly dominant presence of the legendary Tier 1 operator suddenly filled the entire room, instantly dwarfing the men with guns. He locked his piercing blue eyes directly onto Agent Cross. "You ordered the airstrike. On my team," Thomas spoke. His voice was raw, tearing at his throat, but it gained strength and absolute, damning clarity with every single syllable. "You called the fire mission on our coordinates to cover your black budget cash transfer. I saw the handoff. I have the offshore ledger numbers memorized. Account 774 Delta. I saw everything you did to my men." The silence that followed his words was absolute, ringing with the heavy, undeniable weight of truth. The ghost of Ward 7 Bravo had finally spoken, and in doing so, he had dragged the monster entirely out of the shadows and directly into the unforgiving light of justice. Agent Cross's face drained of the last remnants of its color. The sheer arrogance that had defined his entire corrupt existence evaporated into the sterile hospital air. He was replaced by the crushing, humiliating realization that he had been completely outplayed, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered by an injured, supposedly broken soldier and a brilliant, fiercely loyal nurse. His hand shook violently. Slowly, agonizingly, Cross lowered his weapon and let it drop. It hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, defeated thud. "Secure them!" Captain Hayes barked. The military police swarmed the room instantly. They violently shoved Cross and his private contractors against the wall, kicking their legs apart, stripping them of their weapons, and forcefully clicking heavy steel handcuffs around their wrists. As the corrupt agent was dragged out of the room, his legacy utterly destroyed, Captain Hayes immediately keyed his shoulder radio. "I need a surgical trauma team in room 714 right now. Move!" Abby didn't wait for the surgical team. She spun back to the medical cart and grabbed the sterile emergency chest tube tray. Her hands, which had trembled in the presence of the corrupt agent, were now completely steady, fortified by the incredible adrenaline of their victory. She rushed back to Thomas's side. He had collapsed back against the pillows, gasping heavily for air, his body trembling as the immense adrenaline of his confession began to wear off. But as he looked up at her, the haunted, empty look that had defined his existence for the past month was entirely gone. He was smiling. It was a faint, exhausted, but profoundly real smile. Abby leaned down over him to prep the surgical field for the chest tube insertion. As she did, she let her forehead gently rest against his for a brief, incredibly intimate second. The chaos of the room, the shouting soldiers, and the screaming monitors seemed to fade entirely into the background. "I told you, Chief," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion and unshed tears. "I don't lose to arrogant bastards." Thomas closed his eyes, leaning into a gentle touch. His rough, calloused hand weakly found hers on the sterile white bedsheet, his strong fingers slowly intertwining with hers. "Neither do I," he rasped softly, his thumb gently brushing the back of her hand. "Thank you, Abigail." The long, suffocating and deadly silence of Ward 7 Bravo was finally broken. The war that had haunted his mind was over, and as Abby swiftly prepped the scalpel to save his life, Thomas Reynolds realized that for the first time since the Korangal Valley, he had found something, and someone, truly worth living for. What an intense and heart-pounding journey, from the silent, shadowy halls of Walter Reed to the explosive, high-stakes confrontation that finally brought down a corrupt intelligence officer. The ghost of Ward 7 Bravo proves that courage comes in many forms. Abigail Preston showed us that true strength isn't always about carrying a rifle. Sometimes it's about paying attention, fighting for those who have been silenced, and refusing to back down against arrogant people in power. The unbreakable bond forged in silence between Abby and Thomas truly demonstrates the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the healing power of trust. Did this gripping tale of medical espionage, silent romance, and ultimate justice keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this story, please hit that like button, share it with your friends who love a thrilling drama, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, heart-stopping stories. See you in the next video.